Welcome to month 6 of the Dick Cheney Selective Memory Media Tour. The former vice president has not let up at all. He is still making media and public appearances anywhere that will have him, except for this show. And today, during an afternoon visit to the National Press Club in Washington, he hit some of his favorite notes again, calling for the release of those magical, still classified CIA memos he insists prove that torture works and that therefore we should be doing it more. Mr. Cheney also admitted that he and the Bush administration were wrong about Saddam Hussein having a role in the 9/11 attacks.
I do not believe, and I've never seen any evidence to confirm that he was involved in 9/11.
Really? Just like that, huh? After all those years of talking about the evidence that he was connected to 9/11, after all those years of suggesting that Saddam helped al-Qaeda attack this country, it just didn't happen that way. Now he tells us. But who could have been to blame for that colossally false impression? How could we have been under that false impression? Apparently the butler did it, George Tenet.
The prime source of information on the relationship between Iraq and al-Qaeda was George Tenet, who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. That's not something I made up. That's not something I thought of. That's what the director of Central Intelligence was telling us.
So that's why George Tenet got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. On the subject of Guantanamo, Mr. Cheney revealed a new, novel approach to immigration law.
If we had not had Guantanamo, we would have had to take captured terrorists, people we picked up on the battlefield trying to kill Americans, and bring them to the United States. And you would have been faced with a possibility that if a judge had ruled that we had to release them, we would have had no choice but to release them inside the United States.
If we hadn't set up an offshore prison in Cuba, we would have had to bring people from the battlefield to the United States and release them on American streets. That's not the only reason, though, that Mr. Cheney thinks that keeping Guantanamo open is so important. Apparently, the only options for suspects captured by U.S. forces are Guantanamo now or death.
If you're going to be engaged in a world conflict such as we are in terms of global war on terrorism, you know, if you don't have a place where you can hold these people, your only other option is to kill them. And we don't operate that way.
Actually, I think there are 3 options. You could hold them illegally, you could hold them legally, or you could gin up some way to kill them. I will say, as PR work, Mr. Cheney's argument is well made. It leaves out the hold them legally option and thereby makes Guantanamo sound like the better of 2 options. Joining us now is former Florida Senator Bob Graham. He was chair of the Intelligence Committee between 2001 and 2003. Senator Graham, it is so nice to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Rachel, thank you very much for the invitation.
Part of the Bush administration's rationale for the Iraq War was alleging this connection between Saddam and al-Qaeda, long ago disproved. What do you make, having had this catbird seat and this incredibly important role in what happened between 2001 2003, how do you feel about Dick Cheney saying now Saddam had no connection to 9/11, there was never any evidence of that?
Well, I'm glad he finally fessed up. I sometimes think that the vice president is like some of those Japanese soldiers years after the war was over, still living in a cave on a Pacific island, thinking that they're fighting the war still. I think the vice president needs to realize that that war is over. He lost. The American people in November decided we were going to go in a different direction. And I believe that Barack Obama is fulfilling the faith of the American people by the quality of people that he's putting in charge of our national security institutions, such as Senator Clinton at State, keeping Bob Gates at the Department of Defense, General Jones at the National Security Council, and I'm a big fan of Leon Panetta at the CIA.
On the issue of Vice President Cheney, his current credibility, his assessment, and what seems at times to be sort of rewriting history about what happened in the first term of the Bush administration. Today he said that it was Richard Clark's fault that 9/11 was not anticipated. He also said it was George Tenet's fault that the intelligence was wrong about going into Iraq. Any reaction to those blames?
Well, first, I don't think that it's acceptable that the leader of the country or the #2 person in the country takes at face value what he said, that he has a responsibility to validate that this information is correct. Let me tell you what we did in the Senate Intelligence Committee. We received a briefing from George Tenet that said there were precisely 550 sites in Iraq where weapons of mass destruction were being stored or produced. We had pictures from satellites and on the ground. We had street addresses of many of those. When we asked George, where did you get all this information, the answer was from the exiles. Well, they had a little minor conflict of interest, and the only way they were going to get back was in the fumes of a U.S. tank. So then we asked him, who's been on the scene validating what the exiles told us? The answer was zero, that we didn't have anybody in Iraq whose job it was to knock on doors and find out what was really on the other side in these 550 sites. Now, you would think the Vice President of the United States would have asked a few questions challenging the credibility of the information that he was getting, whether it was on weapons of mass destruction or this relationship of Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda.
Both the quality of the CIA's work, the quality of the intelligence community's work, generally speaking, and the use to which that information was put are obviously still very hot issues, still very much being debated. Recently, you have been in the news because your famously fastidious notes about what you do over the course of your workdays, as you have here, were essentially called forth as evidence in the discussion about whether or not Nancy Pelosi was telling the truth about her recollections about the CIA's briefings.
I couldn't comment on what Nancy saw because I was never in a briefing on the subject of enhanced interrogation with Nancy. What I could say is I was told that I was briefed on 4 separate occasions, and there was significant detail as to what the briefing was supposed to have entailed and who was also at the briefing. When I went back to my notes, I found that 3 of the 4 occasions there was no briefing on any subject on that day. And the CIA has now concurred in that and no longer presses that matter, but it says something about the quality of just basic information management.
You've written a new book called America, the Owner's Manual, Making Government Work for You. It's sort of a clarion call to make citizenship participatory. Do you feel like we're getting better at that or worse at that as a citizenry?
We've been getting much worse at it, Rachel. Since the 1970s, there's been a decline in every indicator of citizenship. Voting's been on the decline. Participation in civic organizations, people getting together with their neighbors to solve a problem, all of those had been going south. Now, 2008, we had a little upward bump in voting, and we had a lot of people for the first time involved in a political campaign. That's encouraging. The question is it just an aberration, or is this a representation of a new trend in American citizenship?
Former Senator Bob Graham of Florida, chairman of the Intelligence Committee, of course, between 2001 and 2003, obviously still quite civically engaged yourself, encouraging us all to do the same with the new book. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you very much.
The new book is called America, the Owner's Manual, Making Government Work for You.